Willkommen zurück auf Neutrality Studies. Heute wieder mal auf
Welcome back to Neutrality Studies. Today we're doing this one in German again, because I've got two fellow Swiss guests with me. On one side, historian Dr. R. Roca, head of the Research Institute for Direct Democracy, and on the other, H. Bieri, a certified architect and urban planner, and the managing director of the Swiss Association for Industry and Agriculture. Both are members of the committee behind the Neutrality Initiative, which will be up for a vote in Switzerland in a few months. That's what we'll be talking about today. René, Hans, welcome.
Hans, willkommen.
Thank you for having me.
Danke, dass ihr die Zeit gemacht habt für dieses Gespräch.
Thank you for taking the time to join this conversation. We want to talk about the Neutrality Initiative and why you personally support it. Maybe we can start, especially for our viewers abroad, with a quick explanation. René, what exactly is the Neutrality Initiative? Could you give us a brief overview of what it's about and where things stand in the process right now, as we're speaking today, on March 30th, 2026?
Sprechen am 30. März 2026.
Ja, also sehr gerne. Es ist so, dass
Yes, of course. So the thing is, Swiss neutrality is actually anchored in the Constitution, but only in a fairly weak way. It basically says that the Federal Council and Parliament have to uphold and support neutrality. But that's about it. Now, over the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, really starting in the 1990s, neutrality in Switzerland has been significantly reduced. That means Switzerland has moved closer and closer to the European Union and to NATO. As a result, neutrality is no longer truly practiced or implemented in politics. That's why we decided, Hans Bieri is also part of this committee, that we want to anchor neutrality more concretely in the Constitution. We want to define it more precisely, and that's what we've tried to do with the text of this initiative, which is meant to become a new article in the Swiss Federal Constitution.
Genau, und diese Initiative, die gestartet wurde
Exactly.
von euch, also
And this initiative that you started has been underway since 2022, 2023. Hans, where do we stand now, at the end of March 2026, with the whole process? As I understand it, this vote will probably be presented to the Swiss people by the end of this year. Is that correct?
Wahrscheinlich noch Ende diesen Jahres dem Schweizer Volk unterbreitet. Ist das richtig?
ja, vermutlich im Herbst.
Yes, the vote will probably take place in the fall. A counter-proposal that was discussed in Parliament didn't come together, so the vote is likely to happen this fall.
Ist die Abstimmung wahrscheinlich findet in diesem Herbst statt.
Genau, und das Ganze beruht ja auf unserer Schweizer Tradition.
Exactly. And all of this is based on our Swiss tradition of direct democracy. The idea that we, as citizens, can also propose changes to the Constitution. And these aren't just suggestions. If there are enough signatures, it has to go to a public vote. So at this point, let's bring in René. How was the support you received while collecting signatures? Because you need to gather more than 100,000 of them.
Ihr musstet ja über 100.000 Unterschriften zusammenbringen.
Ja, das war nicht ganz so einfach, weil
Yeah, that wasn't all that easy, because the idea for this new constitutional article came up shortly after the war in Ukraine began. At first, Switzerland didn't actually adopt the EU sanctions. But a few days later, under pressure from the United States and from the big banks, Switzerland went along with them. And that's when we said, this just isn't acceptable. By taking part in those sanctions, Switzerland becomes a participant in the war. It's being drawn into the conflict and can no longer really fulfill its role as a neutral country.
als neutrales Land nicht mehr wirklich erfüllen. Und deshalb haben wir dann uns entschieden.
And that's why we eventually decided to move forward. We spent months working on a draft for the initiative. It's a cross-party working group. These days, the initiative is often pushed into the right-wing corner. That's not true, but of course, it's a political tactic by those who oppose it. They hope that if they can label it as right-wing or conservative, it'll influence voters to reject it. During the signature campaign, we made a conscious effort to build broad support. We knew that if we couldn't get people from the left, to back the initiative, we wouldn't be able to win the final vote.
Dann werden wir die Abstimmung am Schluss nicht gewinnen. Das heißt, die Arbeit
That means the work for the vote actually started back when we were collecting signatures, and thankfully it worked out. Later, there was a call from the left and the Greens to support the initiative. There were several efforts, and I'm still glad today that more and more people on the left are backing it and saying so publicly. And as H. Bieri mentioned, the vote will probably take place in the fall. It's essential that we bring together such a broad range of supporters, because that's the only way we can win the vote. It's something existential for Switzerland.
Es ist existenziell für die Schweiz.
Genau, und wie du gesagt hast, ja auch Hans, es gibt keinen Gegenvorschlag.
Exactly, and as you said, Hans, there's no counter-proposal. That means the Swiss voters will simply be asked, do you want to accept the neutrality initiative? Yes or no? If someone votes yes, what exactly does this initiative say? There are 4 sections, 4 paragraphs. Hans, could you maybe give us a quick overview of what the main part of the initiative is about?
Hans vielleicht uns kurz sagen, was so der Hauptteil der Initiative ist?
So the key point here is the concept of neutrality. And we're having a debate that basically goes like this. People say that anyone who stays neutral in a conflict is in a way supporting the aggressor. That's led to a lot of discussion, to criticism, general criticism of neutrality, because some argue that in an active conflict you simply can't be neutral. And that political debate is ongoing. It needs to be addressed, clarified by saying this. When it comes to conflicts, we can't just look at a single moment in time. We have to be willing to see the entire process of the conflict.
Den Prozess des Konfliktes zu sehen. Und das ist eine nicht einfache Diskussion.
And that's not an easy discussion. Politically, it's led to criticism. People have accused the initiative of taking sides with Russia in the current conflict, the war in Ukraine, for example. These are, of course, difficult debates that need to be addressed. And that's why we have to go back to the neutrality initiative, which defines the concept of neutrality in such a way that you don't take sides, you don't enter into alliances, and in a conflict situation, you act in a way that defends against aggression, but doesn't involve joining any alliances.
Und eben keinen Bündnissen beitritt. Und das ist der Kern der Neutralität.
And that's really the core of the neutrality initiative. In principle, that should be clear. The problem starts where the discussion gets fuzzy, when it's not clear what a neutral position actually means. A neutral position doesn't mean stepping away from the conflict or looking the other way, as people often accuse the initiative of doing. It's about a process of understanding. It means starting to recognize the conflict, its causes, how it developed, and from there, reaching the 4th point, that someone who is neutral is then in a position to help support solutions between the parties in conflict.
Zu unterstützen zwischen den Konfliktparteien.
Thank you. René, could you maybe give a quick explanation of the 4 sections and what they're about?
Worum es geht.
Also gut, der erste Abschnitt ist ganz einfach.
All right, the first section is very simple, but it's important to say this clearly today. Switzerland is permanently neutral, permanently armed and neutral. That's the first section. Then, as Hans Bieri explained, the second section basically says that joining a military alliance is prohibited. It's not allowed. In the third section, which is also very important, we have the ban on sanctions. That means non-military coercive measures are forbidden unless the United Nations decides otherwise. Unfortunately, there's that exception in the UN Charter where the Security Council can decide, now it's war, now we're going to war.
Jetzt ist Krieg, jetzt machen wir einen Krieg. Beispiel ist für mich 1991, das war der.
For me, a good example is 1991, during the Iraq War. Back then, the UN Security Council made that decision. And Switzerland, by the way, even supported those sanctions, even though it wasn't yet a member of the United Nations. So that's an important point, the ban on sanctions. Then, in the fourth section, we really wanted to make it clear that Switzerland has an obligation to act as a mediator. As a neutral country, it should stay in contact with both sides, with all parties to a conflict, to keep the dialogue going and to work toward mediation. Switzerland has done that many times throughout its history. It has a lot of experience with what we call good offices, and that's something we need to strengthen again today.
Und das müssen wir heute wieder stärken. Weil wir sehen ja Iran-Krieg als Beispiel.
Because we can see it right now. Take the Iran war as an example. Pakistan is mediating. Now, Pakistan is a neighboring country of Iran, but it's also caught up in its own conflict with Afghanistan. So why is Pakistan doing this? Or Turkey, for that matter? They both have completely different agendas. Switzerland, on the other hand, has always tried to avoid power politics. The goal has always been to actually end the conflict. And those four sections, by the way, that direct counterproposal Hans Bieri mentioned, wanted to leave out sections 2 and 3. That means the ban on joining military alliances and the ban on sanctions. So now it's actually a good thing that this initiative is coming to a vote with all four sections included.
Exactly. Right now, Switzerland is struggling to define what its neutrality actually means. And it's important to note that the opponents of the Neutrality Initiative argue that we shouldn't be telling the Federal Council, our national government, or our parliament how to define neutrality. They say, where would that lead us if we started writing definitions of our foreign policy concepts directly into the Constitution? But that's precisely the point, and I'll be open about it. I'm one of the supporters. That's exactly what this is about. We want a definition written into the Constitution so we can also show it to other countries and say, look, this is what you can expect from us. This is what our neutrality means.
So verstehen wir Neutralität. Wie sieht's denn im Moment aus?
So what's the situation right now? The other side, the opponents of the Neutrality Initiative, have been accusing it, especially the left-wing Social Democrats, of being a pro-Putin initiative. That's one of the criticisms. And we're talking now at the end of March. The war with Iran, where the United States illegally attacked Iran and Israel also illegally attacked Iran, has been going on for about a month now. Has this illegal war of aggression, which at its core looks very similar to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, led to any new discussions about the Neutrality Initiative? Maybe Hans first, and then Roca.
Vielleicht zuerst Hans und dann René.
So wie ich das beobachte, eigentlich.
As I see it, actually no. Because in any conflict, there's always a narrative in the background that explains it. And in the case of the Iran conflict, the underlying claim or accusation is that Iran poses an existential threat, and that's used to justify the attack. That brings us to the real issue. We have to understand conflicts as ongoing processes. If we reduce a conflict to a single action, to just one moment in time, then we run into this problem. How do we even place that conflict in context?
Ja, wie ordnet man den Konflikt ein? Und die neutrale Position, die versucht ja eben.
And the neutral position is really about trying to break open the perspective of the conflict and develop a broader view. From that standpoint, the goal is to understand the conflict as a whole, not just to pick out a single action in a brief moment and base a position on that. It's about seeing the entire process. And that's exactly where the difficulty lies. We can see it clearly in the conflict with Iran. You can only really understand that conflict if you look at the entire development over the past 70, 80, even 100 years. Otherwise, we won't be able to resolve these kinds of conflicts.
Können wir auch diese Konflikte nicht lösen. Und das ist eigentlich der Kern des Beitrags.
And that's really the core of what neutrality contributes to conflict resolution, that it steps outside the conflict itself. In the short term, I'd say Habermas talked about the colonization of the life world. That means the hegemon simply has the power to define how things are. And of course, that's part of the conflict, or even shapes the conflict itself. This colonization of thought, of how we're supposed to interpret the events we live through, that's what we have to break open. Only then can we return to free, enlightened thinking, which is really the only way to resolve conflicts.
Eigentlich die einzige Möglichkeit ist, auch Konflikte zu lösen.
Ja, René, also das stimmt ja. Also in der Schweiz.
Yes, Renee, that's right. Here in Switzerland, we're right in the middle of these Western narratives. First, Russia is evil. It attacked, so we have to take a stand against it. Second, Iran is also evil. It wants to destroy innocent Israel, so we basically have to support that side too. And of course, that leaves no room at all for neutrality. So, what does the discussion in Switzerland look like right now?
Wie sieht denn jetzt die Diskussion im Moment in der Schweiz aus?
Also ich finde eben, das ist es ist ja schrecklich, ein neuer Krieg.
It's terrible, really. Another war. I completely agree with that view. This is an illegal war of aggression by the United States and Israel against Iran. And actually, it's a very clear example of the kind of debate we're having in Switzerland right now, especially for our federal council, our government. There's one thing I still find unbelievable. They were negotiating a possible treaty, a peace agreement. There were direct talks between the US and Iran. We all saw that. But behind everyone's back, the war was already being prepared. Israel takes the lead, the US follows willingly, and they basically walk away from the negotiating table. That really needs to be said clearly. Where's the credibility in that? Where's the trust? It's all been squandered, and now they want to go back to the negotiating table, but it just doesn't work that way.
Aber das geht doch nicht so. Also das finde ich einfach verrückt, was im Moment da abläuft.
I just find it crazy. What's going on right now? And now, what's the Federal Council doing? Our government waited far too long before finally saying, yes, actually, we are neutral, and really, we should now be banning arms deliveries to the United States. It's a country at war, that's true. And they waited way too long for that. And it's telling, because in an interview, Federal Councillor Ignacio Cassis, that's our foreign minister, said the following. It caused quite a stir in Switzerland, and rightly so. Quote, we have to see how we can muddle through in this restless world. I don't even know how to translate that word, durchwursteln, properly into English. I mean, that's just unbelievable. It really is, isn't it? And that shows exactly where they stand.
Es ist unglaublich, oder? Und das zeigt aber die Position. Und der Bundesrat lehnt natürlich die Initiative ab.
And of course, the Federal Council rejects the initiative. They never get tired of it. Practically every day there are reports saying the Federal Council has once again declared that neutrality should be handled flexibly. I find that unacceptable. To me, that's just muddling through. One moment they say Switzerland is neutral, then the next they say, no, not this time. One day we can deliver weapons, the next day we can't. That shows exactly where the problem is, and that's why we need clarity. That's also why I'm glad we have direct democracy, because now we can really tell the Federal Council where the limits are and instruct them through this new constitutional article. Here are the boundaries. No more sanctions, no further alignment with NATO, and so on.
Keine weitere Annäherung an die NATO und so weiter. Und ich glaube, es ist nur so möglich.
I think that's the only way it can work, and that's the direction the discussion needs to go. This muddling through has to stop. Otherwise, everyone will just say again, that's typical Switzerland, always cherry-picking. Sometimes we look at whether something benefits us, especially economically, and if it doesn't, we just step back. That's why what we need here isn't flexibility, it's clarity. Of course, once the initiative is approved, it'll be written into the Constitution, but it also has to be implemented. So we have to stay on it, keep the discussions going, and make sure we hold the Federal Council, our government, and also Parliament accountable. So what really happened was this. I mentioned that quote from Federal Councillor Cassis, our foreign minister, who said we basically have to muddle through. And that's exactly why this initiative matters, because it forbids the government from doing just that, from muddling through. Our government has to take a clear position as a neutral country. You can compare the situation a bit to the 1930s. Back then, the Federal Council, The Second World War was already underway. Especially Federal Councillor Pilet Golaz, who was also in charge of foreign affairs, said that Switzerland had to adapt to the new realities in Europe. But what did that really mean? Switzerland was surrounded by totalitarian powers.
Was hieß das? Die Schweiz war umgeben von totalitären Mächten. Und dann brauchte es eine geistige Landesverteidigung.
And then, what we needed was a kind of spiritual national defense. In Switzerland, we needed General Guisan, who spoke plainly and said, "The country is neutral, we will defend ourselves, and we'll make sure the price of entering Switzerland is very high." I think that was an important factor back then, also during the First World War, that kept Switzerland from being drawn into those conflicts. And now we're back in a similar situation. Our government, and for the most part also our parliament, want to move closer to NATO and to the European Union. And that's where things get dangerous for Switzerland. It's really existential. If Switzerland keeps going down that path, it will lose its very foundation, you could say.
Also verliert sie ihre Grundlage, kann man sagen.
Yes, and the move toward not just the EU, but also toward NATO, has been happening in huge steps for several years now. Hans, could you maybe tell us a bit about how security is currently being thought about in Switzerland, and how our Federal Council, meaning the government, what their strategy is, what the political strategy of Switzerland is right now?
Also, die ganze Diskussion,
The whole discussion about neutrality and alliance freedom is currently shaped by the question of how a country can defend itself under today's conditions. And of course, that brings in the entire technological transformation and also the growing internationalization of economic relations. In this context, people are saying that even from a military point of view, it's simply impossible to base a defense concept solely on national borders, especially when the country is very small. And that's where some groups argue that, from a purely logistical standpoint, there's really no alternative but to connect ourselves with the military structures that surround us geographically.
Militärischen Strukturen zu verbinden. Und
And right now, that functional argument dominates the discussion. It overshadows the ability of neutrality to act intelligently in a conflict situation. And that's not something you can really debate on the level of military means. It has to be discussed on a different level. That's why it's not helpful to handle this whole issue purely as a technical matter. It was the same during the Second World War. The resources needed to equip armies were so unequal that even back then, you could have said there's no point in trying to defend neutrality, because in the medium term, you simply wouldn't have the economic resources to do it.
Ökonomischen Ressourcen mittelfristig dazu gar nicht hat. Und deswegen ist
And that's why this whole debate about usefulness, which is coming up again now, from certain military circles but also from political ones, completely misses the point and the essence of neutrality. It's not just a question of economic resources or logistics, for example. One of the questions was whether American transport planes should be allowed to fly over Switzerland or not. And with questions like that, people try to make neutrality look a bit absurd by saying it doesn't really matter anyway, because we're already part of a larger process that supposedly leaves us no choice but to align ourselves with NATO's overarching framework.
Dem übergeordneten Dispositiv der NATO anzuschließen. Und diese Diskussionen werden
And these discussions are taking place, but they always show that people don't start from the idea of neutrality. Let's look back. During the Second World War, many of the arguments that are now used against neutrality already existed back then, or were just as valid at the time. And yet people saw that neutrality is a way of acting in a conflict, an independent stance that actually has an effect. Within that context, we have to learn how to move and how to understand the meaning of neutrality. It's not just utilitarian, as is often claimed, like saying someone just wants to survive under the protection of others while the bullets are flying. It also has an enlightening role within a conflict. That was true during the Second World War, and it's becoming clear now that this voice is still needed.
Jetzt eben deutlich, dass es diese Stimme braucht. Ja.
I think what Hans is saying here is really important. It's about this question of independence, whether Switzerland can and wants to be independent, whether it wants to have its own interpretation and its own approach, or not. And there are basically two groups. Some say, we can't do that at all. Without NATO weapons, we're finished. And then there are others who say, we shouldn't even try, because NATO are the good guys, and we should be with the good guys, not the bad ones. René, how do you see this debate developing right now, especially from the opposing side, which is fighting the neutrality initiative so fiercely? And we also know that both the federal government and the federal parliament are against letting the initiative go through.
Ja, eben, man muss in diesem Zusammenhang daran erinnern.
Yes, we have to remember that there have always been initiatives that didn't find much support, that were rejected by everyone, by all parties, the Federal Council and Parliament, and yet they still passed. That's what's so interesting about the Swiss model. Politically and culturally, it allows for real discussion, and in the end, the people have the final say. They can decide differently, and sometimes they have to. I also think, as Hans Bieri just explained, that the debate is practically impossible for the opponents of the initiative, right? Because that would mean Switzerland is giving up its principles. If you try to handle neutrality flexibly, one way today, another way tomorrow, that just doesn't work.
Geht das so nicht, oder? Und ein zweites Mitglied unserer Regierung,
And a second member of our government, Karen Keller-Sutter, said to students last year what the Federal Council's mindset really is. She said, neutrality is, to some extent, an opportunistic concept. An opportunistic concept. So if the government is acting like this against us in the referendum campaign, I actually feel quite confident that we'll make it through, because we have the stronger arguments. And we can show that neutrality is in fact a peace project. It's work for peace. Switzerland must not pursue a power-driven agenda or try to offer itself up somewhere. It has to act as a neutral country, one that demands respect for humanitarian law, for international law, and for human rights. That is Switzerland's role.
Das ist die Rolle der Schweiz. Und notabene können wir so, das müssen.
And by the way, this also allows us, and as supporters of the initiative, we really need to make this point clearly, to uphold Switzerland's entire humanitarian tradition. The Red Cross, disaster relief, and everything else Switzerland has built, which has been a blessing for the rest of the world as well. We've always been active in that field. The Red Cross is the most important humanitarian organization present in every conflict, and it even has a mandate that requires it to be there. And now we're hearing about the difficulties the Red Cross is facing. In my view, that's because Switzerland is no longer a neutral country. The trust is gone. People no longer respect the symbol of the Red Cross, which, after all, is the reverse of the Swiss flag. And the whole founding story of the Red Cross, Henri Dunant, the merchant from Geneva who built it together with others, I mean, that's something we really need to make clear.
Ich meine, das müssen wir klar machen. Das ist unsere Position, also nicht das Durchwursteln.
That's our position. Not muddling through, not a lack of principles, not some opportunistic concept. It's exactly the opposite of what Hans Bieri described. It's a reasonable, enlightened position. And that's why we should also be able to address the pacifism of the left. I really don't understand why the Social Democrats and the Greens, as parties, as people with party membership, are against it. You said it yourself, Pascal. They call it a Putin initiative. They want to mock it, but they don't have any real arguments. I just don't hear any solid arguments from the other side, from the opponents. And that's why it's up to us to make sure people understand what this is really about. That neutrality is part of our country's DNA.
Das ist die DNA unseres Staates, die Neutralität.
I think the strongest argument, or rather, the one most often used by the other side, is that in the case of an illegal war of aggression, when it's absolutely clear that one state is attacking another, neutrality should actually take a back seat to the UN Charter, because the UN Charter prohibits the use of force. And when a state is attacked, the other UN members also have a responsibility to help defend that state. That argument has been made ad nauseum, especially in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. Hans, what's the situation right now? You've already touched on it a bit, but this idea that you can't be neutral when there's a clear aggressor and a clear victim, that neutrality only makes sense if both sides are attacking each other. Where does that argument stand in Switzerland today? Does it still have much support in the national debate?
In der nationalen Debatte.
Ja,
Well, the real question in any conflict is, how do we look at it? What's the perspective? If an act of aggression can be clearly identified and the United Nations also condemns that aggression, then there's a certain agreement that this action is a violation. And from a neutral standpoint, you can call it that. How should I put it? The discussion is difficult precisely because when we talk about aggression, there's always a backstory. It might be that, from a broader point of view, what looks like aggression is actually an act of self-defense against a threat that came before it. And that's exactly why these clarifications are necessary. Otherwise, the debate ends up being just what we often see in the media, where a single event is described in isolation, and from there, the whole argument is built.
Die Argumentation weiterführt. Also das ist der Februar 2022.
So we're talking about February 2022 and October 2024. And that's the frame from which the whole argument is being made. And that's also how the media presents the current situation. In every article, in every statement you see in the media, the starting point is always the same, the beginning of the war. From there, the cards are already on the table, and it's basically clear how you're expected to behave. That means the idea of neutrality has already been pushed aside. You can't really talk about neutrality anymore because it's practically no longer the topic. The topic now is the conflict itself, as defined, emphasized, and reinforced by the media. And under those conditions, any real discussion of neutrality just isn't possible.
Eine Klärung im Sinne der Neutralität gar nicht möglich.
When good and
evil are assigned right from the start in the media, there's just not much room left, mentally, for neutrality. But René, how's this debate going right now? Because in the end, as supporters of the initiative, we actually don't need to worry about what the Federal Council or Parliament think. We only need to focus on what the majority of voters think, and on how we get our arguments out to the people, literally. So, what does this debate look like at the moment among the Swiss public?
Zwischen den Schweizerinnen und Schweizern.
Ja, also ich bestätige das, was Hans Bieri
Yes, I can confirm what Mr. Bieri said about the media. It really is a big problem that the media, especially the mainstream media, have so much influence. But more and more we're seeing alternative media out there, so people can get informed if they want to. And I think a lot of them do. I'm still a history teacher myself, and I have to say, I'm now actually glad that my students don't read the daily newspapers anymore. I used to tell them all the time, you should read a paper every day, and so on. But now, I'm honestly glad they don't. They get their information from alternative media instead.
Sie orientieren sich aber an alternativen Medien. Zum Beispiel hören Sie ein Interview von dir, Pascal.
For example, they might listen to an interview with you, Pascal, or maybe something from Global Bridge or Zeitfragen. There are so many ways to really study what H. Bieri explained, the background of a conflict in detail. What exactly happened there? Now we basically have an aggressor. But what does the conflict actually look like? And I mean, when I talk with my students about the First World War, of course I don't start with the conflict itself and say, well, at some point Germany attacked, then someone responded, and suddenly Europe was at war.
Und dann hat der und der reagiert und dann war Europa im Krieg. Ich muss ja die Ursachen des Konfliktes, muss ich ja
I need to make the causes of the conflict really clear. For example, imperialism at the time, the whole system of alliances, and the arms buildup. We're seeing a similar situation in Europe today, just like before the First World War. And I have to look at that carefully so I can work through it with my students. The war didn't just fall from the sky. There were clear actors, there were war plans, things were prepared in advance. Take the Schlieffen Plan, for instance, in the First World War. But there were also plans on the British side, and so on. I think it's important to make that clear, that kind of critical understanding that H. Bieri also mentioned. Now, in this referendum campaign, we have to succeed in creating a counter-public, something that stands up to the mainstream media, so we can get our message across.
Damit wir das durchbringen. Und ich hoffe sehr, dass Sie uns nicht den Mund verbieten.
And I really hope they don't try to silence us, that we can still write what we want, because the trend is clearly moving in that direction, toward a world where freedom of speech no longer exists. Right now in Switzerland, until the end of March, there's a public consultation on the new national security strategy. What I find very concerning there is the section about information. It always talks about propaganda and disinformation campaigns. But once again, our government and the authorities want to decide what's true and what's false. And in a free Switzerland, that's exactly what we don't need. What we need is open, free debate.
Brauchen wir natürlich nicht. Wir brauchen den freien Diskurs. Und ich hoffe sehr, es wird sich jetzt weisen, dass man...
And I really hope it'll become clear now that no one can just tell us to stop, but that we're free to do this. It's all in support of this initiative, because we want to present our arguments, and in my view, these truly are arguments, not populism. This is something fundamental. It's existential, really. Switzerland must hold on to its neutrality and anchor it again in that way. And I'm actually quite confident because we're seeing momentum from left to right. H. Bieri and I have organized a roundtable where we're inviting everyone who supports the initiative. We're getting a lot of positive responses, and I really hope we can keep building on that in the coming months.
In den nächsten Monaten weiterarbeiten können.
Das finde ich sehr gut und sehr wichtig.
I think that's very good and very important. And again, the main point of this initiative is to write a definition into the Constitution and give it two solid foundations: military neutrality, but also economic neutrality. Switzerland is taking its own path, trying to have a positive influence on the conflict, instead of making things worse by throwing even more weapons into the fire. That would actually be quite reasonable. May I ask both of you, first Hans and then René, for a final comment? Maybe something that hasn't been mentioned yet, something you'd like to add. Hans, you first.
Noch einbringen möchtet, zuerst Hans.
Ja, wir sehen ja jetzt...
We can see now that this conflict is also having consequences when it comes to resources, and we're gradually starting to feel that, especially through energy. That, of course, affects supply as well. At the end of the 19th century, Switzerland was the most free trade-oriented country, but the result of the First World War was that we faced a major supply crisis. And it was precisely in that situation that it became clear once again that a neutral position, meaning not taking part in any alliances, can actually help improve or support the global supply situation.
Oder sagen wir mal, stützen kann. Das heißt also, auch von daher würde ich sagen, wir sollten...
That means, from that point of view, I'd say we should use a neutral position, not only to promote peace, but also to support economic balance, and to understand the economy as something that should work to everyone's mutual benefit. And then, those questions start to resolve themselves, the ones where people now claim it's all just about territorial expansion, that China wants to expand its territory, that Russia wants to expand its territory, that the United States wants to expand its empire from its island position, so to speak. So all these debates could actually be brought back to a more modest, reasonable view of economic cooperation.
Wirtschaftliche Versorgungsvernunft dazu kommt zu sehen, also Wie gehen wir vernünftig mit unseren Ressourcen?
So how do we handle our resources in a sensible way? We live in a world where work is divided, and of course that requires exchange. And if we make an effort to organize that exchange so that it benefits both sides, then we've basically solved the conflicts we're facing right now. That basic attitude should also guide how we think about supply, meaning we should rebuild those economic relationships on a foundation of trust. That's how we can respond, with rational reason, to all the irritation that's currently, you could say, being stirred up.
Mit rationaler Vernunft zu begegnen versucht.
Den rationalen Diskurs auf
To bring rational discussion back into the debate on international politics and not think about everything only on an emotional level. René, please, the final word goes to you.
Danke. Ich würde gerne noch kurz zwei Punkte erwähnen.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to briefly mention 2 points, or rather pick up on what Hans Bieri just said. This economic position takes backbone. That means Switzerland has to keep following its own special path, even though it's often criticized for it. It needs to remain an example, a model, in its entire political structure. Direct democracy, federalism, neutrality. And that's not easy. You get attacked, you get criticized. It takes backbone, and that's exactly what we're missing right now. When we look at our neighboring countries, when we look at the EU, at NATO, they're bowing down to the United States, to Israel.
Die machen Bücklinge vor den USA, vor Israel. Es ist ja nicht zum Aushalten, wie man da.
It's really unbearable how people deny themselves like that. And Switzerland doesn't need to do the same or go along with it. What we need is some real backbone. And when it comes to the economy, that's actually a good point, a positive one. Probably this fall, at the same time as the Neutrality Initiative, there'll be a vote on loosening the War Materials Act. By the way, it was the Social Democrats who launched that referendum. So here in Switzerland, we know both the initiative, like the Neutrality Initiative, and the referendum. We can say, we want a public vote on this law. And as for the loosening of the War Materials Act, I signed that referendum myself.
Ich habe dieses Referendum auch unterschrieben. Ich finde das wichtig, dass man dagegen anhält.
I think it's important to push back against that. Maybe it'll be possible to start a discussion with the left about it. Because honestly, I don't understand how someone can be against this relaxation and at the same time against the initiative. The initiative is a pacifist concept. It's about peace. So we need a yes to the initiative and a no to this relaxation. I believe Switzerland should have a strict law on war materials. You can't just deliver weapons to selected countries. I'm sorry, but that's exactly what this relaxation would allow. Exports to 25 countries, including the United States, by the way. They want to send weapons even to countries involved in armed conflicts. So if this relaxation goes through, the Swiss Federal Council would no longer be able to say, we're stopping arms deliveries to the United States. That's just unbelievable. And that would basically mean the end of neutrality. So maybe it'll be possible to find some common ground here with different political groups that are now attacking the initiative so that we can actually get it passed and stop this loosening of the arms export law. I really hope so. And maybe it's actually a good thing if there's a dialogue, a real debate about both issues. They can actually be connected quite well.
Über beides, das kann man eigentlich relativ gut verbinden da.
Das kann man und das muss man zusammen denken.
You can and you have to think about those things together. To sum it up briefly, Switzerland is once again searching for its identity and its soul. Where is it headed? Toward war and arms exports? Or will reason prevail and we'll say to ourselves, no, stick to what you know best. Swiss men and women, hold on to your neutrality. It has served you well. Dear Hans Bieri, dear Werner Roca, thank you for your time today.
Lieber Hans Bieri, lieber Werner Roca, danke für eure Zeit heute.
Danke.
Thank you as well. Thanks. All good.
Bestens.